Good afternoon. This is Andrea Maceyra, Supervisor, Tax and Marketing Practices, the Texas Alcoholic Beverage Commission. Today's lesson is an introduction on how to successfully obtain label approval for your alcoholic beverage products. Before we begin, here are a few housekeeping items. This presentation can be found on YouTube. The chat feature will be enabled at the end of the presentation. Today's general overview will include how to submit a complete malt beverage, wine, distilled spirits, and low wine application.
It's bigger.
We'll gain a better understanding of the TABC label review process and labeling requirements. A label approval is required for nearly all alcoholic beverage products that are to be sold in the Texas market. The Tax and Marketing Practices Division is tasked with reviewing labels to ensure they are compliant with state law. Once their certificate of label approval has been issued, the public can find it on TABC's public inquiry webpage. Moving into malt beverage category. Here are the code and rules sections which pertain to malt beverage label approval. The malt beverage category is broken into two classifications, beer and ale. Beer is considered 4.0% alcohol by weight and less. For labeling purposes, that equate to 5.1% alcohol by volume. Ale is 4.01% alcohol by weight and greater. For labeling purposes, that equate to 5.2% alcohol by volume. Listed are the different types of permits required in order to produce beer and ale. A brew pub license covers both beer and ale. Here are items to include when submitting a malt beverage label application. You may submit multiple sizes on one application if they are the same brand. For example, your product is Andrea's Pale Ale and you have 2 keg sizes and 1 bottle size. You may submit all 3 sizes on one application. You are required to pay a $20 fee for each size. Be sure to include a legible copy of each size with your application. Include a copy of your TTB Cola. A TTB Cola is not required for product brewed in Texas and only sold in Texas. Lastly, you'll need to submit 2 samples to our lab or provide an independent analysis with your application. As part of our review process, we check to make sure the applicant has an active permit. We look at the chemical analysis to see if it matches what is on the label. Variance does not apply when determining classification for beer and ale. We also confirm that you hold the correct permits based on the product and classification. We review the TTB Cola if necessary. Here's an example of a malt beverage label. Starting from the top, working clockwise, we check to make sure the manufacturer and location is stated and make sure a permit is issued at the stated location. We check the alcohol content for classification. Does it match the chemical analysis? If you state you are a beer and do not state alcohol content, your chemical analysis needs to reflect you are a beer. We look at style, fanciful name, government warning, and net contents. Additionally, we check for statements of contract brewing and alternating proprietorship, name, trade name, or trademark of any retail licensee or permittee, and for promotion-specific language. Listed are the items mentioned in the previous slide, including the corresponding statutory references. statute allows for contract brewing and alternating brewery proprietorship. Contract brewing laws allow for two brewing facilities to work together to brew product based on capacity or other business needs. Keep in mind, all parties will need to hold permits at all brewing locations. Alternating brewery proprietorship allows for one brewery who doesn't have a brewing facility to utilize another brewer's facility to manufacture their own product. The entity operating under this agreement will need to obtain a TABC license or permit where they conduct business, as well as the brewing location. Industry defines collaboration as purely creative in nature and no money is going back and forth. The Label Approval Division reviews each label to determine if collaboration would constitute a contract brewing alternating proprietorship agreement or a tier violation. Things to know about malt beverage applications. We process in the order in which received. We keep chemical analysis on file for 5 years. The division operates on a 10-10 policy. The application has 10 days to respond to a correction letter, or the application will be withdrawn. Should you respond within the 10 days and further corrections are needed, there's a maximum of 20 days to resolve any issues with your label approval application. Otherwise, the application will be withdrawn. Common errors that can be fixed prior to submission are: be sure to ensure that you have attached all required documentation. When submitting an application online, be sure to click the attached button once you have browsed and selected your documents. Don't forget to send in samples or an independent analysis. Moving on to wine. Listed are the wine and rules that pertain to wine label approval. You will need to hold a non-resident seller's permit or a winery permit in order to apply for label approval for wine. Listed are items to include when submitting a wine label application. A separate state application is required for each TTB COLA. Attach a legible copy of your TTB COLA. A $20 fee is required per application. A non-resident seller must be the primary American source of supply and will need to provide a letter of authorization. As part of our review process, we check to make sure the applicant has an active permit. We check to make sure it is a complete application. We check if the TTB COLA is attached and valid, and that the label image matches the application and the TTB COLA. Here's an example of a letter of authorization for wine. An application must provide a letter of authorization granting them authority to import into Texas if they are the primary American source. Things to know about wine applications. We process in the order in which received. The division operates on a 10-10 policy. The application has 10 days to Applicant has 10 days to respond to a correction letter, or the application will be withdrawn. Should you respond within the 10 days and further corrections are needed, there's a maximum of 20 days to resolve any issues with your label approval application. Otherwise, the application will be withdrawn. Be sure to attach all required documents to the application, including the letter of authorization and your TTB COLA. Applications will be withdrawn that are incomplete, that have permitting issues, and are missing a letter of authorization and TTB COLA. Common errors that can be fixed prior to submission are to be sure to attach all required documentation. When submitting online, be sure to click the attached button once you have browsed and selected your documents. Moving on to distilled spirits. Listed are the code and rules that pertain to distilled spirits label approval. You will need to hold a non-resident seller's permit or a distiller's rectifier's permit in order to apply for label approval for distilled spirits. Listed are items to include when submitting a distilled spirits label. application. A separate state application is required for each TTB cola. Attach a label copy of your TTB cola. A $25 fee is required per application. A non-resident seller must be the primary American source of supply and will need to provide a letter of authorization. As part of our review process, we check to make sure the applicant has an active permit. We check to make sure it is a complete application. We check if the TTB cola is attached and valid, and that the label image matches the application and TTB cola. Here's another example of a letter of authorization. An applicant must provide a letter of authorization granting them authority to import into Texas if they are the primary American source. Things to know about distilled spirit applications. We process in the order in which received. The division operates on a 10-10 policy. The applicant has 10 days to respond to a correction letter or the application will be withdrawn. Should you respond within the 10 days and further corrections are needed, there's a maximum of 20 days to resolve any issues with your label approval application. Otherwise, the application will be withdrawn. Be sure to attach all required documents to the application, including the letter of authorization and your TTB cola. Applications will be withdrawn that are incomplete, that have permitting issues, and or missing the letter of authorization and TTB cola. Common errors that can be fixed prior to submission are to be sure to attach all required documentation. When submitting online, be sure to click the attach button once you have browsed and selected your documents. Moving to low wine. Listed are the code and rules that pertain to low wine label approval. Low wine is classified as a wine having less than 7% alcohol by volume. You will need to hold a non-resident seller's permit or winery permit in order to apply for label approval application for low wine. Oftentimes, ciders are considered a low wine. Listed are items to include when submitting a low wine label application. A $25 fee is required per application. You will need to include a letter of authorization with your application. Lastly, you'll need to submit 2 samples to our lab or provide an independent analysis with your application. We check to make sure the label has the product name and address of the manufacturer, packager, distributor, or importer, government warning, net contents, and alcohol content. Things to know about low wine applications. We process in the order in which received. The division operates on a 10-10 policy. The applicant has 10 days to respond to a correction letter or the application will be withdrawn. Should you respond within the 10 days and further corrections are needed, there's a maximum of 20 days to resolve any issues with your label approval application. Otherwise, the application will be withdrawn. Be sure to attach all required documents to the application, including the letter of authorization. Applications will be withdrawn that are incomplete, that have permanent issues, and are missing a letter of authorization. Common errors can be fixed prior to submission are to be sure to attach all required documentation. When submitting online, be sure to click the attach button once you have browsed and selected your documents. Don't forget to send in samples or independent analysis. So in summary, know your classifications for malt beverages, know your labeling requirements, differ based on beverage category, know TABC process and procedures to avoid delays in label approval. When in doubt, call the label approval team at 512-206-3410. If you have questions about this presentation, here are some instructions. Now we'll take some questions. Yes, it is just considered a label revision. So the question was, if you have a new label submitted, but the recipe is the same, is the ABV lab report required? We should have it on file. We hold them for 5 years, and it's just considered a label revision. If you are a brewer, so that's an in-state brewery or an in-state manufacturer, so you hold a B or a BA, you do need to have label approval for product, even if it is not going into market. If you're selling it in your tap room, forgive me. Brew pubs do not need to receive label approval if it's only being sold on the premise. Once it enters into distribution, the brew pub will need to obtain label approval. We don't have a template, but our label approval team can work with you on the language and show you, give you examples of the ones that we showed in our PowerPoint, and we can provide those for you. The question is, if you brew a beer in Houston and Austin, but our primary place of business is in Houston, what label requirements do we need to meet for address requirements and statement of contract brewing? So if your primary place of business is Houston, you would have a permit in Houston and Austin, and you can just state Houston as your primary place of business. On your application, there's a box for you to check that says contract brewing, and then you list the location where you're contracting. And it goes for alternating as well. Question is, does the contract brewer need to be on the can label too? No, they do not. Barbara asked, can I obtain a copy of the form you just showed? Yes. Please email label.approval@tabc.texas.gov. Any more questions? Okay, well, we will go ahead and conclude. If we don't have any more questions, you can always contact us at label.approval@tabc.texas.gov or 512-206-3410 should you have any questions. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day.